Picture a mudflat, not a harbour, not a valley, not a river crossing or a mountain pass, none of the things that gave birth to every great city before it. Just a shallow, salt-stinking lagoon on the northeastern edge of Italy, full of reeds and mosquitoes and absolutely nothing else. This is where Venice began. Not because anyone chose it. Not because it was strategic or fertile or defensible in any traditional sense. It was chosen because desperate people, fleeing an army that burned everything it touched, had nowhere else to go. Attila's Huns were at their backs. The sea was in front. They waded in. What followed over the next 800 years would become one of the strangest financial stories in human history. A city with no farmland grew rich enough to feed armies it never raised. A republic with no gold mines hoarded more gold than most kingdoms. A state with no territory controlled the trade routes of 3 continents. At its peak, Venice didn't just participate in the global economy. It was the global economy. But here's what nobody tells you. The real secret of Venice had nothing to do with geography, or luck, or even brilliance. It had to do with a financial idea so cold and so calculated that it still shapes how money moves today. So, how does a city built on water, with nothing to sell and nowhere to farm, become the richest empire on Earth? Part 1. The Lagoon Republic. By the 600s, the refugees in the lagoon had stopped waiting to go home. They couldn't go home. The mainland was still burning. First Huns, then Lombards, then one barbarian wave after another, crashing through what had been the Western Roman Empire. The people huddled on those mudflats made a decision, quietly and without ceremony. This is where we live now. So they built. Not farms, there was no soil. Not fortresses, there was no stone. They drove wooden stakes into the lagoon floor and built on top of them. Thousands of stakes, then tens of thousands, then millions. The entire city of Venice is sitting, right now, on a forest of ancient timber driven into the mud, slowly petrifying over centuries into something harder than stone. That engineering instinct, solve the problem you have, not the one you wish you had, ran through everything Venice would ever do. Without farmland, they traded. Without raw materials, they specialized. Without an army, they built a navy. And without a king, crucially, without a king, they built a republic. Sort of. Venice was governed by a council of merchant families who called themselves a democracy. It wasn't. It was an oligarchy with excellent public relations. The Doge, the elected leader, was chosen through a process so labyrinthine, so deliberately convoluted, that modern political scientists still study it to understand how to prevent any single family from seizing power. 30 electors, chosen by lot, reduced to 9, who chose 40, who were reduced to 12. You get the idea. The point wasn't fairness. The point was stability. Venice understood, centuries before anyone put it into words, that the greatest threat to a trading empire isn't invasion, it's internal instability. And while every other medieval power was consumed by succession wars and noble vendettas, Venice just kept trading. By the 900s they had a monopoly on salt from the Adriatic. Small thing, salt. Except it wasn't. Salt was refrigeration. Salt was food preservation. Salt was, in the world before cold storage, the difference between eating in winter and starving. Venice didn't have gold. They had salt, and they used it to buy everything else. But salt was just the beginning, because the real money, the unimaginable, empire-building money, was in something that came from the other side of the world. Silk, spices. The trade routes that connected Europe to Asia ran through one choke point, and Venice had just figured out how to own it. But controlling a trade route and actually profiting from one are very different things. The mechanism Venice invented to do both, nobody had ever tried it before. Part 2. The financial machine. Here's a fact that sounds impossible. At its height, Venice, a city of roughly 100,000 people, controlled somewhere between a third and a half of all Mediterranean trade. One city, 100,000 people, half the sea. The mechanism was the commenda. It sounds obscure. It wasn't. The commenda was a contract, a partnership between a merchant who had money but couldn't sail and a merchant who could sail but had no money. The investor put up capital. The trader put up his life. When the ship came back, if it came back, they split the profit. If it sank, the trader lost nothing but time, and the investor lost everything. This was not charity. This was risk distribution. For the first time in European history, you didn't need to be wealthy and brave to get rich from trade. You just needed to be wealthy. You could sit in Venice, invest in a dozen voyages simultaneously, lose 3 of them to storms and pirates, and still come out ahead on the other 9. And the traders, the ones doing the actual sailing, could take risks they never could have afforded alone because they weren't risking their own money. Venice took the oldest human fear, losing what you have, and turned it into a product. That idea is now called venture capital. It was born in a medieval Venetian counting house. By the 1100s, the money flowing through Venice was so vast that the city needed a way to move it without physically moving it. Carrying gold across the Mediterranean was slow, dangerous, and expensive. So Venetian merchants invented something better, a piece of paper, a bill of exchange. You deposit gold in Venice, you receive a letter, you present the letter in Constantinople, and you receive the equivalent in local currency on the other side. No gold ships, no robbery, just paper and trust, and the full commercial weight of the Venetian Republic standing behind that trust. The modern bank transfer is a direct descendant of this idea, but Venice wasn't content to just move money. They needed to protect the routes the money travelled through, and this is where the story gets dark. In 1197, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade, the Fourth Crusade. The goal? Retake Jerusalem from Saladin's successors. Tens of thousands of European knights signed up. They needed ships to get there. There was only one place in the Mediterranean with enough ships: Venice. The Doge at the time was Enrico Dandolo. He was in his 90s. He was almost completely blind. And he was one of the most dangerous negotiators who had ever lived. The Crusaders needed Venetian ships. Venice had a price. And the price wasn't money. It was something far more valuable. What Dandolo asked for in exchange would redirect 30,000 armed men away from Jerusalem and straight into the heart of the Christian world's greatest city. This wasn't betrayal. This was business. Part 3. The Fourth Crusade and the Great Betrayal. Enrico Dandolo's deal with the Crusaders was simple in structure and monstrous in implication. Venice would provide the ships, enough for 33,000 soldiers, 4,500 horses, 9,000 squires, in exchange for 85,000 silver marks. A colossal sum. The Crusaders couldn't pay it. They'd raised barely half. So Dandolo offered an alternative: work off the debt by helping Venice recapture the city of Zara, a coastal port that had defected to Hungary. The Pope expressly forbade it. The Crusaders attacked Zara anyway. Then Dandolo did something even more audacious. A Byzantine prince, Alexios, son of the deposed emperor, arrived in the Crusader camp with an offer. Help him retake Constantinople, he said. In return, he'd pay off all the Crusaders' remaining debt to Venice and reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Dandolo listened. He smiled. Ha ha ha! He agreed. Whether the plan originated with Dandolo or he simply recognized its potential, nobody can say for certain. All we know is the outcome. In 1204, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the largest, wealthiest city in Christendom, while the Venetian fleet waited in the harbour. The city burned for 3 days. When the smoke cleared, Venice walked away with 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire. Not conquered land, trade routes, ports, islands, the choke points of the eastern Mediterranean, Corfu, Crete, the Peloponnese. They didn't want farms or subjects. They wanted nodes, strategic positions from which to tax, toll, and control the flow of everything that moved by sea. Here's the paradox. Venice committed what most of Europe called an atrocity, and used it to build the most sophisticated commercial network the medieval world had ever seen. They weren't conquerors. They were infrastructure. Think about that in modern terms. This is the equivalent of a financial services company engineering a competitor's collapse, then buying their data centers at bankruptcy prices, not to run them, but to charge everyone else for access. Venice didn't build an empire by taking things. They built it by positioning themselves between everyone else and the things they wanted. For 2 more centuries, Venice held the world in a kind of elegant financial chokehold. The wealth was extraordinary. The system seemed invincible. And then, in 1498, one Portuguese sailor changed everything, not with an army, not with a war, with a map. Part 4. The slow collapse of the inevitable. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and kept sailing north. He wasn't looking for Venice. He wasn't even thinking about Venice. He was looking for spices. But when his ships returned to Lisbon loaded with pepper, cinnamon and cloves, purchased directly in India, bypassing every Arab middleman, every Ottoman toll, every Venetian tax, the price of those spices in Lisbon was 1/5 of what they cost in Venice. 1/5. The monopoly that Venice had built and defended, and, when necessary, betrayed entire crusades to protect, gone. Not broken by war, not dismantled by negotiation, simply circumnavigated. Venice didn't collapse overnight. Empires never do. They declined through a long, expensive argument with reality. The Venetians invested in their own spice routes to the east. They upgraded their arsenal, the world's first industrial shipyard, which at its peak could fully assemble a war galley in a single day in an assembly line process that preceded Henry Ford by 400 years. They innovated. They adapted. But the fundamental equation had changed. The value Venice offered was access. When you could sail around Africa and buy the same goods at the source, access to the Mediterranean choke points was worth considerably less. And a city whose entire identity, whose entire wealth, whose entire reason for existence was built on being the necessary intermediary between East and West. That city had a serious problem when the necessity disappeared. By the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire had also closed off most of the overland routes Venice still controlled. From both directions, sea and land, the walls were closing in. What's haunting about Venice's decline isn't the drama of it. It's the quiet. The merchant families didn't lose their elegance. The palaces didn't crumble overnight. The canals kept flowing. But the urgency drained away, slowly, like water from a lagoon at low tide. The city that had turned desperation into innovation, mud into marble, refugees into bankers, that city had, somewhere along the way, forgotten what made it exceptional. It had started protecting what it had, instead of building what came next. And there, on that last mudflat, the city that began with nothing, looked around at everything it had accumulated, and found it wasn't enough to save it. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte ended the Venetian Republic with a letter, not a battle. A letter. He told the last Doge that Venice was finished, and the Doge, with nowhere to go and no army to call, agreed. 1,000 years of independent existence dissolved in an afternoon. But here's what Napoleon couldn't dissolve. The ideas. The commander. Risk distribution between capital and labor still drives every startup investment on Earth. The bill of exchange, trust encoded in paper, became the global banking system. The arsenal's assembly line became the Industrial Revolution. The Venetian model of controlling nodes, rather than territory, became the playbook for every tech platform that followed. Venice never had land. It never had armies in the traditional sense. What it had was a clarity, almost brutally clear, about where value actually lived. Value lives in the connection between things, not in the things themselves. A mudflat in a lagoon is worthless until it sits between two worlds that need each other. Follow the money. Follow the power. And we'll see you next time on Thrones and Loans.